The bullies beat up the girl, thinking they would get away with it, but everything changed when her father, Chuck Norris, showed up. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments where you are watching from. The town of Navasota, Texas, breathed with the rhythm of a quiet heart. The mornings were always the same, sunlight breaking across the rooftops, the slow hum of cars heading toward the small collection of stores on Main Street, and the faint laughter of children already gathering at the schoolyard before the bell. It was the sort of town where everyone knew who owned what truck, which family was struggling, and who baked the best pies for the Sunday fair. On the surface, nothing seemed out of place, but beneath the stillness, small storms sometimes gathered where no one cared to look. For Dana Lee, the youngest daughter of Chuck Norris, the schoolyard had become such a place. She was 16, a quiet spirit in a loud world. Where others rushed to be noticed, she preferred slipping unnoticed through the crowded halls, her books hugged tightly to her chest, her gaze often fixed on the pages of a novel, even while walking. Her heart belonged to the gentle things, sketching horses in her notebook, listening to country music by her window, writing small poems that she never showed anyone. But what made her tender heart beautiful also made it a target. The boys had noticed her early that year, 3 of them who moved together like a pack of stray dogs. They were older, bigger, and full of the cruel confidence that comes from knowing the world often looks away when boys make trouble. The leader, Ryan Collier, was the son of a county official whose voice carried weight at town meetings. Ryan knew this and wore it like a badge of invincibility. At his side were Brent and Kyle, one eager to mimic every sneer Ryan delivered, the other quiet and brooding, but far more dangerous when he acted. On that first week of September, as Dana Lee walked into the yard clutching her math book, Ryan's voice cut through the chatter of the other students. "Hey, preacher's girl," he called, though he knew well enough she wasn't. "Where's your stunt double? Or does Daddy do all your fighting for you?" His laugh was sharp, a sound that sliced into her like a knife. Brent and Kyle laughed too, circling around her as if it were all a show put on for the other kids. Dana Lee lowered her head, hoping to pass through them, but Brent bumped her shoulder so hard her book spilled across the dirt. Pages bent, the clean white edges now smudged with brown. She bent to gather them, but Kyle's shoe came down over the open cover of her English textbook, grinding it into the dust. She froze, her hands trembling, but said nothing. Laughter rippled through the crowd. It was not the first time, and deep inside she feared it would not be the last. That evening at home, the contrast was unbearable. The Norris household was alive with warmth. Chuck had just returned from filming a short promotional spot in Dallas, and he sat at the head of the table, his presence filling the room in that quiet, commanding way of his. Gina, his wife, moved gracefully around the kitchen, bringing in bowls of vegetables and a roast chicken. The older children spoke of their plans and small victories, the normal chatter of a family bound by loyalty and love. Dana Lee sat at her place, fork in hand, pushing food across her plate rather than eating it. Chuck noticed, though he didn't say so immediately. His eyes, sharp and watchful despite the years, caught the tension in her shoulders, the way her smile was a shadow rather than the real thing. When the meal had ended, he lingered, sipping his coffee, and finally asked, "Everything all right at school, sweetheart?" Her heart jumped. She forced a smile, shook her head quickly, and answered, "Yeah, Dad, just a lot of homework. That's all." Chuck studied her for a long moment, but she held his gaze until he nodded. "All right," he said softly, though the tone carried more weight than the words. Gina, too, had noticed, but mothers and fathers often shared unspoken agreements. Let it rest for now. Watch closely later. Later that night, Dana Lee sat by her window, journal open on her lap. The pages were filled with small sketches of horses running free, lines of poetry about rivers and stars. But on the margins, she had written words she couldn't speak aloud. "I wish I were stronger. I wish I could be like him." Her pen pressed so hard the ink bled through the page. She thought of her father's stories, of how he had trained in martial arts, of how people spoke of him as if he were untouchable, a legend both on screen and in life. And here she was, his daughter, too frightened to even look her tormentors in the eye. The next day proved no better. The trio cornered her near the lockers, their voices mocking, their laughter echoing off the metal doors. Ryan plucked her sketchbook from her bag, flipping through it while Brent and Kyle pressed close on either side. "Look at this," Ryan sneered. "What is this, horses? You think you're some kind of artist? Pathetic." He ripped a page clean from the spiral and crumpled it into a ball. Her stomach nodded, but she said nothing. By lunchtime, word had spread that Ryan Collier had made Danilee cry, though she had hidden in the girls' restroom so no one could see. For the rest of the day, she walked like a ghost, her shoulders hunched, her eyes down. At home again, she stayed quiet, slipping away before anyone could ask questions. Chuck watched her leave the table early, his brow furrowed, and turned to Gina. "Something's wrong. She's carrying something heavy." "I know," Gina said, her voice low, "but she's not ready to tell us yet." Chuck leaned back in his chair, his jaw tight. In his world, problems were faced head-on. But this was his daughter, and the rules of battle were different when it came to the heart. That night, Danilee dreamt of standing in the middle of the schoolyard, the boys circling her. In the dream, she raised her hands like she'd seen her father do, her stance firm, her eyes unflinching. But when she tried to move, her feet were heavy, rooted to the ground. The laughter grew louder until it drowned everything else. She woke with tears on her cheeks. The days that followed only deepened the shadows. The boys pushed harder, and each small cruelty chipped away at her spirit. She found herself walking slower to school, pausing outside the gates, wishing for the courage to turn around and run home. At the dinner table, her silence grew heavier, and though she tried to laugh when her father made a joke, the sound never reached her eyes. Chuck, watching her one evening as she retreated to her room, felt the same instinct he had on countless missions, on sets where stunts went wrong, in training halls where students hid injuries. It was the instinct of a fighter who knew when someone was bleeding inside. He set down his mug of coffee, his eyes narrowing. "She's not telling us," he murmured to Gina, "but something is happening. I can feel it." Gina placed her hand over his. "Then we'll be ready for when she finally does." Outside, the Texas sky burned with sunset, streaks of red and gold spreading across the horizon. In the stillness of that evening, Danilee stood at her window, whispering words only the stars could hear. "I just want it to stop." She pressed her forehead against the glass, her reflection staring back at her with weary eyes. But the storms that gather quietly are often the ones that strike with the greatest force. And as the days in Navasota grew shorter and the air turned crisp with the hint of autumn, Danilee Harper Norris was about to discover that shadows only grow darker before the light breaks through. The morning after her whispered plea to the stars, Danilee walked into the schoolyard with her books pressed tightly to her chest. She had slept little, her eyes heavy, her heart heavier still. The September air carried the scent of cut grass and asphalt warmed by the early sun, but nothing about it brought comfort. She could already feel their eyes on her, those three shadows that seemed to stretch across every hallway, every corner, every space she dared to step into. Ryan Collier was leaning against the fence when she arrived, his arms crossed, his smirk wide. Beside him, Brent kicked idly at a can, while Kyle stood silent as always, his expression blank but his presence threatening. When Ryan's gaze fell on her, she felt it like a hook dragging her forward. "Morning, Princess," he called out, loud enough for the crowd of students nearby to hear. "Where's Daddy's bodyguards?" "Oh, right, you left them in Hollywood." A wave of laughter rippled through the students who had gathered to watch. Danilee's stomach tightened. She lowered her eyes and tried to slip past them, but Ryan stepped into her path, blocking the way. Brent darted forward, tugged at the strap of her bag, and before she could react, her books spilled once more across the dirt. Her sketchbook fell open, its pages fluttering like wings desperate to escape. Ryan stooped to pick it up, flipping through the drawings. "Look at this," he sneered, tearing one page free and holding it up like evidence of a crime. "Horses, sunsets, pathetic. You really think anyone cares about this?" He crumpled the page in his fist while Brent and Kyle chuckled. Danilee bent to gather her books, her fingers trembling as she pressed the bent covers to her chest. Her throat ached with words she couldn't speak. She wanted to scream, to fight, to tell them to leave her alone. But her voice felt caged, trapped behind the bars of fear. The bell rang and she escaped into the building, though escape was not the right word. The halls were no safer. Whispers followed her, laughter echoing against the lockers. At lunch, she sat alone, her food untouched. She watched as the trio held court at their table, their voices loud, their arrogance unchecked. No teacher intervened, no student stood up. Everyone knew Ryan's father was a county official, a man with power, the sort who shook hands at parades and scolded school boards into silence. Who would dare challenge his son? That afternoon in the crowded locker room, Brent and Kyle struck again. They yanked her bag from her shoulders and tipped it out across the floor. A bottle of water was upended over her textbooks, pages curling as ink ran down in blue rivers. She scrambled to gather them, cheeks burning as laughter filled the room. "What's the matter?" Brent jeered. "You gonna cry again?" Ryan didn't even bother to look back as he walked out. He didn't need to. His dominance had been established, his pack eager to enforce it. By the end of the day, Danilee's spirit felt like glass chipped at the edges, ready to crack. She walked slowly toward the parking lot, clutching her ruined books, praying she could reach home without another encounter. The late afternoon sun stretched shadows long across the pavement. She breathed relief when she reached her brother's car, but even as she slid into the seat, she felt eyes on her, watching. That night at dinner, she barely touched her food. Gina noticed, her mother's eyes soft but searching. "Sweetheart, you've hardly eaten," she said gently. Danilee forced a smile. "I'm just tired, Mom." Chuck studied her in silence. His instincts told him more than her words ever could. He saw the way her hands lingered near her lap, as if she needed to hold something together. He saw the faint tremble in her voice when she spoke. After dinner, he found her in the living room, staring blankly at the pages of an open book. He lowered himself into the armchair across from her. "You know," he said lightly, "I used to hate school too. Not the training halls, not the practice mats, but the classrooms. I always felt like I didn't belong there." Her eyes flickered up, uncertain. "You? You were never afraid of anything." He chuckled softly. "That's not true. Everyone's afraid of something. What matters is what you do when you feel it." She wanted to tell him everything in that moment. She wanted to spill the truth, to cry into his arms the way she had as a child when nightmares woke her in the night. But the words stuck. She didn't want him to think she was weak. He was Chuck Norris. He had stared down opponents in rings, villains on screens, and far more dangerous men in real life. What would he think of a daughter who couldn't even stand up to a few school bullies? So she smiled faintly and said, "It's nothing, Dad, just schoolwork." He nodded, though his eyes narrowed ever so slightly. He had been lied to before, but never by one of his children. Still, he let it go, for now. Later, alone in her room, Danilee stared at the ceiling, her thoughts churning. She remembered the afternoons in the training room when her father had shown her basic blocks and strikes. "It's not about being stronger than the other person," he had told her. "It's about believing you have the right to stand your ground." She had laughed then, treating it like a game. Now she wished she had listened more carefully. The next day the cycle repeated. The laughter, the whispers, the humiliation. Ryan ripped another page from her sketchbook and waved it around the cafeteria like a flag. "Look at this masterpiece," he shouted. "The great artist at work." Brent hooted, Kyle smirked, and the rest of the cafeteria pretended not to notice, because it was easier to laugh than to stand alone. By the end of the week, Danilee's silence weighed on her like an anchor. She sat in her room with her journal, filling page after page with words she would never speak aloud. "I don't belong here. I don't know how to stop them. I wish I could disappear." She pressed the pen so hard the paper tore. Downstairs, Chuck spoke quietly with Gina. "She's hiding something," he said. "She's carrying it like a stone in her chest." Gina laid a hand on his arm. "She'll come to us when she's ready." Chuck shook his head. "What if by the time she's ready it's too late?" His voice was low, edged with the fear only a father could know. In the days that followed, he watched her more closely. He saw how she walked slower toward the school gates, how her smile had vanished, how her eyes searched for something unseen. The instincts that had guided him through years of battles now whispered to him that his daughter was in one of her own. But battles of the heart are not easily fought. And for Danilee, the silence was beginning to feel like a prison with walls that grew higher each day. She told herself she could handle it, that she had to handle it, because to confess would mean admitting weakness. Yet deep inside, she longed for a voice to tell her she was not alone. The storm clouds were gathering, unseen by most, but felt by her with every mocking laugh and cruel shove. And though she did not yet know it, the storm was about to break in ways none of them could control. The weight of silence pressed harder with each passing day, and though Danilee tried to convince herself she could bear it, the cracks were beginning to show. By Friday afternoon, her nerves were stretched thin, her steps slower than usual as she left the final class of the week. The Texas sun was dipping low, painting the cracked pavement in long streaks of amber, and all she wanted was to reach the safety of home. She clutched her books to her chest, her backpack hanging loosely off one shoulder, her eyes fixed on the ground as if by not looking she could make herself invisible. But shadows do not vanish when ignored. Ryan, Brent, and Kyle had been waiting. They had learned her habits, the routes she took home, the places where the crowds thinned and no teachers or parents lingered. They leaned against the wall of a narrow alley that cut between the gymnasium and the parking lot, their posture casual but their eyes sharp with intent. Ryan twirled a baseball bat loosely in one hand, the aluminum catching the last light of day, while Brent and Kyle cracked jokes at her expense, as though the assault had already begun in their minds. When she saw them, her breath caught in her throat. She thought of turning back, but Ryan stepped forward, blocking her way. "Going somewhere?" he asked, his grin wide and cruel. Brent and Kyle flanked him, the three of them forming a wall that seemed impossible to pass. "I just want to go home," she whispered, though her voice barely rose above the rustle of the wind. "Home?" Ryan mocked. "Don't you want to stay and play with us? You've been ignoring us all week, and that's just rude." Brent laughed, circling around her. "Maybe she thinks she's too good for us. You know who her dad is, right? She probably thinks she's royalty." Kyle said nothing, but his silence was more menacing than their laughter. He simply cracked his knuckles and stepped closer. Danilee's heart hammered against her ribs. She tried to edge past them, but Ryan shoved her shoulder, forcing her back into the narrow space of the alley. The walls loomed close on either side, the shadows deepening as the sun sank lower. It felt like a trap closing in, and she knew she was running out of choices. "Leave me alone," as she said, a little louder this time, though her voice still shook. "Or what?" Ryan sneered. He lifted the bat and tapped it lightly against his palm. "You gonna call Daddy? Maybe he'll come karate kick us all into shape." His laugh echoed in the alley, cold and sharp. Brent snatched the books from her arms, tossing them onto the ground. Pages bent and scattered, her sketches torn loose and carried by the breeze. He stomped on one of the drawings, grinding it into the dirt with his heel. "Oops," he said, feigning innocence. Danilee's vision blurred with tears, but anger flared beneath them. She remembered her father's words, lessons he had repeated over and over. Never give up, never stand down when you have the right to fight for yourself. She raised her hands slightly just as he had taught her, palms open, ready to block. Ryan laughed at the gesture. "Look at this. She thinks she's a fighter." In a sudden burst of courage, Danilee shoved Brent backward. He stumbled, surprised, and she darted toward the mouth of the alley. But Kyle moved faster than she expected. He caught her arm and twisted, forcing her back against the wall. Pain shot up her shoulder and she cried out. But she remembered another lesson. Don't fight strength with strength, use leverage. She stamped down on his foot, twisting her body sharply, and managed to break free. For a moment, hope surged, but Ryan's bat swung through the air, grazing her ribs with a dull thud. The shock stole her breath, and she staggered, falling to her knees. Brent was on her in an instant, yanking at her backpack, laughing as she struggled. "Not so tough now, are you?" he jeered. She scrambled to her feet, blocking another shove, pushing Brent away with all the strength she had left. For a heartbeat, she felt victorious, until Ryan loomed in front of her again, the bat raised high. His eyes glittered with the thrill of power. "Time to teach you a real lesson," he said. The world slowed. Danilee's thoughts raced, her heart pounding so loudly it drowned out everything else. She remembered the nights when her father had shown her stances, the way he corrected her grip, the way he told her that fighting was never about anger, but about survival. She raised her arms, bracing for the blow, but she knew deep down she couldn't stop it. Her voice broke as she whispered, "Dad!" The bat began to descend, the air hissing as it cut downward. She closed her eyes, bracing for the pain, for the crack of bone or the burst of agony that would follow. Her knees trembled, her body ready to collapse. And then a new sound filled the alley, slow, measured footsteps. The kind of sound that carried weight, not just in volume, but in presence. A voice followed, calm and steady, yet sharp enough to cut through the haze of fear. "That's enough." Her eyes flew open. At the mouth of the alley, standing tall with the setting sun at his back, was her father, Chuck Norris. For a moment the boys froze, their laughter dying in their throats. The bat halted mid-swing, Ryan's arms stiff as his mind struggled to process what he was seeing. Chuck's shadow stretched long across the alley, his face unreadable, his eyes fixed on the three boys with a calm that was somehow more frightening than rage. Danilee felt her breath rush back into her lungs, her knees nearly giving out in relief. Her father was here. Ryan tried to recover, forcing a smirk, though his voice wavered. "What are you doing here, old man? This is just between us kids." Chuck took another step forward, his boots striking the ground with quiet authority. "Step away from my daughter," he said, his tone low and even, but carrying the weight of a command that brooked no defiance. Brent laughed nervously. "You think we're scared of you? You can't touch us. We didn't do anything." But none of them moved closer. Danilee pressed herself against the wall, her chest heaving, her eyes locked on her father. She could see it in his posture, in the way his body shifted ever so slightly. He was ready for them, ready for anything. And for the first time in days, she felt safe. The trap that had been sprung was not hers anymore. It belonged to them now, though they had no idea just how much danger they were truly in. The alley was wrapped in silence, the kind that comes just before a storm breaks. Dust swirled at the edges where the fading light bled into shadows, and all that remained was the sound of slow, measured footsteps. Chuck Norris walked forward, his eyes locked on the three boys who only seconds before had been circling his daughter like wolves around prey. Now they stood frozen, the baseball bat still raised but unmoving in Ryan's grip, his smirk faltering as if it had been wiped away by an invisible hand. "Step away from my daughter," Chuck said again, his voice calm and low, but each word landed like the crack of thunder. He wasn't yelling, and he didn't need to. Authority came off him in waves, filling the narrow space of the alley until even the boys could feel it pressing against their skin. Ryan swallowed hard, trying to gather himself. "We weren't doing anything," he muttered, lowering the bat slightly, though he tried to keep his posture strong. "Just talking." "Talking," Chuck repeated, his gaze flicking from the bat to the bruises already forming on Danilee's arms. He took another step forward, the leather of his boots scuffing against the gravel. "That's what you call it?" Brent forced a laugh, though it rang hollow. "We were just messing around. She's fine." Chuck's eyes narrowed. "She doesn't look fine to me." The quiet in his tone made the boys shift uncomfortably. They had expected shouting, maybe even threats they could brush off with bravado. But this calmness was something different. It carried weight, the kind of weight that reminded them of the stories they had heard whispered in town. The ones about what Chuck Norris had done before he was a Hollywood name, before the jokes and the posters, when he was a fighter and a soldier. Ryan puffed out his chest, trying to reclaim the moment. "Look, old man, you can't scare us. We're not afraid of you." He lifted the bat again, but his hands shook. Chuck moved then, not fast, but with a deliberate grace that drew all eyes to him. In less than a second, he closed the distance, his hands snapping out to seize Ryan's wrist. With a twist so quick it seemed effortless, he wrenched the bat free and sent it clattering to the ground. Ryan yelped, his knees buckling as Chuck's grip forced him down. Brent lunged forward, panicked, but Chuck pivoted, his elbow driving lightly yet precisely into the boy's ribs. Brent gasped, the air whooshing from his lungs as he crumpled against the wall. Kyle tried next, his fist clenched, but Chuck sidestepped, catching his arm and redirecting his momentum until he slammed face first into the brick wall behind him. It was over in seconds. The three boys groaned on the ground, their arrogance shattered as thoroughly as their plan. Chuck released Ryan, who collapsed beside the fallen bat, clutching his wrist. 3 against 1 little girl, Chuck said, his voice low, steady. That's not courage. That's cowardice. He crouched slightly, meeting Ryan's eyes. You think because you're bigger, because your father holds a title, that gives you power? Power is protecting those who can't protect themselves. Power is standing up when others stay silent. What you've done here isn't power, it's weakness. Ryan's face flushed red, a mix of pain and shame. He wanted to retort, to spit out something cruel, but under Chuck's gaze the words died. Brent tried to rise, still gasping for breath. We didn't mean... Chuck cut him off with a look. You meant every second of it. You enjoyed it. But hear me now. This ends tonight. You lay a hand on my daughter again, you even speak her name with cruelty, and you'll answer to me. And I promise you, you won't enjoy that answer. Kyle, still leaning against the wall, muttered, You can't touch us. My dad... Chuck stepped closer, his presence looming, and the boy's words choked in his throat. I don't care who your father is. I don't care about names or titles. All I care about is my daughter's safety. You remember that. The 3 boys sat in silence. Their earlier bravado evaporated like mist under the sun. Chuck turned then, his expression softening as he looked at Dannelly. She stood a few feet away, pressed against the wall, her breath still unsteady, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and awe. He reached out his hand. Come on, sweetheart. She hesitated only a moment before rushing forward, clutching his arm like a lifeline. Tears blurred her vision, and she buried her face against his chest, inhaling the familiar scent of leather and aftershave. Dad, she whispered, her voice breaking. I know, he murmured, wrapping an arm around her shoulders, holding her close. You don't have to say it. For a long moment they stayed like that, the world narrowing to the circle of his embrace. The boys shifted uncomfortably, no longer the predators, but the shamed, exposed for what they truly were. Chuck finally looked back at them, his voice cutting through the quiet. Get out of here! They scrambled to their feet, stumbling over each other in their haste to leave. Ryan left the bat behind, too afraid to pick it up under Chuck's watchful gaze. Within seconds, their footsteps faded down the street, swallowed by the hum of the evening. Only then did Chuck release a slow breath. He tilted Dannelly's chin up gently, searching her eyes. Did they hurt you? She shook her head quickly, though the truth was written in the bruises already forming along her arms. I'm okay, she said, though her voice wavered. He studied her for a long moment, then nodded. You're stronger than you know, but you never have to face this alone. Do you understand me? Never. Her throat tightened. She wanted to tell him everything. The weeks of torment, the laughter that followed her like shadows, the silence she had buried herself in. But the words refused to come. Instead, she nodded, and he seemed to understand more than her silence confessed. Together they walked out of the alley, his arms still resting protectively around her shoulders. The last light of the sun stretched across the horizon, painting the sky in deep purples and reds. For the first time in weeks, she felt like she could breathe. But even as relief flooded her, somewhere deep inside she knew this wasn't over. Boys like Ryan didn't forget humiliation, and fathers like his didn't forgive challenges to their pride. Still, in that moment, walking beside the man the world called a legend, all she could feel was safety. The storm had been broken, at least for now, and she leaned into her father's steady presence as they made their way home. The night, however, would bring new battles. The air in the alley was still heavy with the echoes of what had just happened. The scrape of shoes retreating down the street had faded, but their presence lingered like a sour smell. Chuck stood silently for a moment, his arm wrapped protectively around his daughter's shoulders. Dannelly clung to him, her body trembling, though now from release rather than fear. She pressed her face into his chest, breathing hard, trying to let go of the terror that had built inside her all these weeks. For her, the nightmare was ending in her father's embrace. For the 3 boys who thought cruelty was power, the nightmare was only beginning. They hadn't gotten far. Chuck's voice carried after them, strong and commanding. Stop! It was not a shout, not the bark of authority, but something deeper. It was the kind of voice that made men halt even against their will. The boys froze at the mouth of the alley and turned slowly, like guilty dogs called to heel. Their faces were pale, their eyes darting between one another, but the authority in Chuck's tone gave them no choice. "You're not walking away without hearing me," he said, releasing Danielle gently. He stepped forward, his boots crunching softly on the gravel. "You think this is over because I stopped you. It isn't. What matters is what comes after." Ryan tried to summon his bravado again, though it was fractured and thin. "We didn't do anything wrong. We were just messing around. She's fine." Chuck's gaze cut through him like glass. "Messing around?" He pointed at Danielle's arm, where a bruise had already started to bloom in angry purple. "That's what you call it? You corner a girl, 3 against 1, you raise a bat over her head, and you call that messing around?" "No, Ryan, that's not messing around. That's cowardice. And you need to hear the truth because no one else has had the courage to say it to you." The boys shifted uneasily, Brent rubbing at his ribs, Kyle still avoiding his eyes. Chuck stepped closer, his voice calm but sharp as steel. "I've spent my life in places where men believe strength comes from hurting others. I've seen the damage it does, not just to the people they hurt, but to themselves. You think this makes you powerful? It doesn't. It makes you weak. It makes you small." Ryan swallowed, his lips trembling, though he fought to hold his smirk. "My dad." "Your dad can't save you from the truth," Chuck interrupted firmly. "And the truth is, you've mistaken fear for respect. You can scare kids into silence. You can hide behind your father's name. But deep down, you know none of that makes you strong. It just makes you desperate." For the first time, Ryan's eyes wavered. His shoulders slumped slightly, though he quickly tried to mask it. Brent spoke up then, his voice shaky. "We were just doing what everyone else does. Nobody ever stops us." Chuck looked at him, his tone softening but not losing its edge. "That's the problem, Brent. People see cruelty and they turn away because it's easier. But I'm not turning away. And from this night on, if you even think of hurting her again, you won't be dealing with a girl who stays silent. You'll be dealing with me. And believe me when I say that's not a lesson you want to learn the hard way." "Hanachitsumun." The words hung in the air, heavy and unshakable. The boys stood frozen, their faces pale, their arrogance stripped away. Even Kyle, who had spoken the least, now avoided Chuck's gaze, his jaw clenched as if holding back the weight of shame. Chuck stepped back toward his daughter, his hand resting on her shoulder. "You boys remember this. True strength isn't in how hard you hit or how many you can knock down. It's in protecting those who can't fight for themselves. It's in knowing when to stop. One day you'll understand that. But if you don't learn it soon, life will teach it to you, and life doesn't pull its punches." For a long, tense moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the whisper of the wind rustling through the alley. Finally, Chuck nodded toward the street. "Now go." This time they didn't hesitate. They stumbled away quickly, disappearing into the darkening streets, leaving behind the bat, the crumpled papers, and the lingering sting of their cruelty. Danielle exhaled, her knees weakening beneath her. Chuck steadied her with an arm, guiding her gently toward the open street where the fading light painted the horizon in shades of deep crimson. The world seemed quieter now, though the pounding of her heart still echoed in her ears. She leaned into him, whispering, "Thank you." He kissed the top of her head softly. "You never have to thank me for that, sweetheart. You're my daughter. I'll always protect you." "But I couldn't stop them," she said, her voice breaking. "I tried, Dad. I remembered what you taught me, but it wasn't enough." Chuck slowed his steps, turning her gently so she faced him. His eyes, deep and steady, held hers as he said, "Listen to me. You did more than you know. You stood up. You didn't give in completely. That takes courage. And courage isn't about winning every fight. It's about refusing to give up, even when you're scared. That's real strength. You hear me?" Tears welled in her eyes, but she nodded. He wiped one away with his thumb, his touch tender. "You're stronger than you think, Danielle. But you don't have to carry this alone anymore." They walked home together under the thickening dusk, the warmth of his hand steady on her shoulder. She knew this wasn't the end. Tomorrow at school, there would be whispers, stares, and maybe more attempts to humiliate her. But tonight, For the first time in weeks, she felt lighter. Her father had stood for her, had shown her that she wasn't alone in this storm. At home, Gina met them at the door, her eyes widening when she saw the bruise on Danilee's arm and the dirt smudges across her clothes. "What happened?" she demanded, her voice sharp with fear. Chuck met her gaze calmly. "We'll talk, but for now she needs rest." Danilee slipped past them, heading upstairs to wash away the dust of the alley. As the water ran over her hands, she stared at her reflection in the mirror. She no longer saw only fear staring back. She saw the faint glimmer of something else, something her father had seen in her all along. Strength. And though she didn't yet know how, she promised herself she would learn to carry it. The night wrapped the Norris home in a quiet stillness, broken only by the hum of crickets and the occasional bark of a distant dog. Inside, the warmth of the living room lights spilled over the wooden floors, but the atmosphere was tense, charged with the residue of what had unfolded only hours before. Danilee had retreated upstairs to wash, her footsteps light, her silence heavier than ever. Chuck remained by the door with Gina, his arms folded, his expression thoughtful and grave. "She's been hiding this for weeks," Gina said softly, her voice laced with both worry and guilt. "I should have pressed her. I should have known." Chuck shook his head. "She didn't want us to see it. She thought she had to handle it on her own. That's what hurts me most. She believed she had to carry it in silence." His jaw tightened as he added, "No child of mine should ever feel they have to fight alone." Upstairs, Danilee stood in front of the mirror in her room, her hair damp, her eyes red from crying. She touched the faint bruise on her arm and flinched, not from the pain but from the memory. The bat, the laughter, the terror that had frozen her heart, she could still feel it. Yet alongside it lived the image of her father stepping into the alley. The way the world had shifted the instant his voice cut through the air. She had never seen anyone move with such certainty, such control. For a moment she wondered if this was what real safety felt like, the kind that could not be broken by fear. She sat on the edge of her bed, hugging her knees to her chest, staring at the shadows that danced on the wall. When a soft knock sounded at the door, her heart jumped. "Come in," she whispered. The door opened slowly, and her father stepped inside. He closed it behind him, crossing the room with quiet steps before lowering himself onto the bed beside her. For a moment he said nothing, only placing a hand gently over hers, grounding her in his calm presence. "You don't have to talk if you're not ready," he said softly, "but I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." Her throat tightened and tears blurred her vision. She shook her head, whispering, "I didn't want you to know. I didn't want you to think I was weak." Chuck turned toward her, his expression both tender and firm. "Weak? Sweetheart, you face them every single day. You walk back into that school, even knowing what was waiting for you. That's not weakness. That's courage. And tonight, you tried to fight back. You remembered what I taught you. You stood your ground even when you were outnumbered. That's strength, Danilee. Do you hear me? That's strength." She covered her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking. "But I couldn't stop them. I thought about everything you showed me, but it wasn't enough. I wasn't enough." He pulled her hands gently away from her face and cupped her chin, lifting her gaze to meet his. His eyes, steady and filled with love, held her there. "You will never hear me say you aren't enough. Not ever. You fought as much as you could, but no one should have to fight alone. That's why I was there. That's why I will always be there. Because you're my daughter, and protecting you isn't just something I do. It's who I am." Her tears spilled freely, and she leaned against him, her cheek pressed to his shoulder. He wrapped his arm around her, strong and unyielding, and she felt the steady rhythm of his heartbeat beneath her ear. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to let go, to release all the fear and shame she had carried. Downstairs, the murmur of voices drifted faintly from the kitchen. Her siblings had gathered, curious about what had happened, worried but respectful of the space Chuck and Danilee needed. Gina reassured them softly, though her own heart ached at the thought of her youngest daughter suffering in silence. Back upstairs, Chuck spoke again, his voice calm and certain. "I've lived long enough to know that bullies don't stop on their own. They test you, push you, trying to see how much they can take before you break. But they picked the wrong girl this time, and I promise you, they won't get another chance. Danley lifted her head slightly. What if they do? What if they come back? Then we'll face them together, he said without hesitation. You'll learn more. I'll train you harder. You'll discover the strength you've always had, and the next time you'll see them for what they are, small boys pretending to be giants. And when that day comes, you'll stand taller than all of them. She wanted to believe him. His confidence was like a fire, steady and unwavering, and it warmed her even as doubt lingered at the edges of her mind. But the way he looked at her, as though he already saw the strength inside her, made her wonder if maybe, just maybe, he was right. A knock came at the door, and Gina stepped in, her face lined with concern. She glanced at her husband, then at her daughter, and her eyes softened. Are you two all right? Chuck nodded. We're getting there. Gina came closer, resting a hand on Danley's arm. You don't ever have to hide from us again, sweetheart. We're your family. Whatever it is, we can carry it together. Danley's eyes brimmed with fresh tears, but she smiled through them, a small, fragile smile that hinted at hope. She reached out and took her mother's hand, squeezing it tightly. For the rest of the evening, they sat together, the three of them bound not just by blood, but by the quiet resilience that only family could provide. Downstairs, laughter eventually returned as the siblings told stories, their voices carrying up the staircase like a reminder that the world was not all cruelty and fear. When at last the house grew still and Danley lay beneath her blankets, she felt her father's words echoing in her mind. Strength wasn't the absence of fear. Strength was choosing to stand despite it. She closed her eyes, and for the first time in many nights, sleep came without nightmares. In the quiet of his own room, Chuck sat by the window, gazing out at the moonlit fields. His jaw was set, his thoughts heavy. He knew the fight wasn't truly over. Boys like Ryan didn't take humiliation lightly, and fathers like his didn't let challenges to their power go unanswered. The days ahead might bring more storms, perhaps harder than the last, but he was ready. Whatever came, his daughter would never face it alone again. And as he turned off the light and lay beside Gina, he whispered into the darkness, more to himself than to anyone else. She's stronger than she knows, and I'll make sure she never forgets it. Morning light slipped through the curtains in soft golden beams, stirring the house awake after a long night of silence. The stillness that had cloaked the Norris home felt lighter now, less like the weight of worry and more like the pause before change. Downstairs, the smell of coffee mingled with the sound of Gina's quiet movements in the kitchen, while Chuck sat at the table, his gaze distant, his thoughts fixed on the path ahead. He knew yesterday had been a turning point, but he also knew the road was far from over. Danley came down the stairs slowly, her backpack slung over one shoulder, her hair brushed neatly, but her eyes still shadowed by uncertainty. When she reached the bottom step, her father looked up. For a moment she hesitated, then crossed the kitchen and slid into the chair beside him. Ready for school? He asked gently. She nodded, though the gesture was small. I think so. He studied her face, searching for the courage he knew was buried there. It won't be easy. People will talk. They'll whisper. They'll stare. But you walk in with your head high and you remember there's nothing they can say that defines you. Only you can do that. She drew in a deep breath. I'll try. He reached across the table and squeezed her hand. That's all I ask. The drive to school was quiet, the hum of the truck's engine filling the spaces where words might have been. When they arrived, the parking lot seemed to hum with anticipation. News traveled fast in towns like this, and already clusters of students were gathered in small knots, their eyes darting toward her as she stepped from the truck. She felt the weight of their stares, the sharp edges of whispered conversations. But beside her stood her father, his presence a shield against the tide. As she walked through the gates, the whispers grew louder. Some faces showed curiosity, others smirked with cruel delight, but a few looked on with something closer to respect. Word had spread. The Norris girl had been cornered, and her father had appeared like a force of nature, scattering her tormentors with nothing but his hands and his voice. The story had already twisted in the retelling, each version more dramatic than the last. But beneath the exaggerations lay one undeniable truth. She was no longer invisible. Inside the cafeteria, Ryan sat with Brent and Kyle, their laughter quieter than usual, their eyes flicking nervously toward her whenever she passed. Ryan's arm was wrapped in a bandage he didn't need, his wrist still sore from the grip that had brought him to his knees. He tried to sneer when their eyes met, but the expression faltered almost immediately. The balance of power had shifted, and he knew it. For the first time, Danielle felt something stir inside her that wasn't fear. It wasn't confidence yet, not fully, but it was the seed of it. She walked to her table, her back straighter, her chin higher, ignoring the whispers that buzzed like insects around her. After school, she found her father waiting, leaning casually against the truck. "How was it?" he asked as she climbed in. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "Different? They didn't touch me. They just stared." "That's because they know now," Chuck said. "They know they can't push you without consequences." "But what if they try again?" she asked quietly. He smiled faintly. "Then you'll be ready." That evening, he led her out to the training area behind the house, the place where he had taught countless students over the years. The air smelled of grass and earth, the fading sun painting the fields in hues of orange and gold. He handed her a pair of training gloves, his expression both serious and encouraging. "You've got more in you than you realize," he said. "Tonight we start pulling it out." They began with the basic stances, blocks, controlled strikes. He corrected her form with gentle touches, guiding her movements until they flowed more naturally. Sweat dampened her brow, but with each repetition she felt a spark of strength she hadn't known she possessed. She stumbled, she faltered, but every time she rose again, her father's voice steady at her side. "Good. Again. You're faster this time. Don't think about what they did. Focus on what you can do." The evening deepened into night, and the stars emerged overhead, but still they trained. When at last she sank onto the grass, exhausted but smiling for the first time in what felt like forever, he sat beside her. "You see," he said softly, "you're not weak. You never were. You just needed to find the part of yourself that knows how strong you are." She looked up at the sky, the endless stretch of stars above, and whispered, "I think I'm starting to believe you." He draped an arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. "That's all you need. Belief. The rest will follow." In the days that followed, the shift became clearer. At school, the whispers began to fade. Some still mocked from the safety of distance, but none dared touch her again. A few even offered shy smiles, as though silently apologizing for their silence when she had needed them most. Ryan, Brent, and Kyle walked with their heads lower, the memory of their humiliation still fresh. They no longer prowled the halls with the same swagger, their power stripped away by the one thing they had never expected: resistance. At home, life grew warmer again. Laughter returned to the dinner table, the kind of laughter that came from shared stories and easy comfort. Gina watched her daughter closely, relief softening her features each time she caught the small changes, the straighter posture, the steadier gaze, the quiet confidence blooming where once there had only been fear. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the sky glowed with streaks of purple, Chuck stood with Danielle on the porch, the field stretching wide before them. She leaned against the railing, her arms crossed loosely, a thoughtful expression on her face. "Do you ever get tired of fighting?" she asked suddenly. He looked at her, his eyes softening. "Fighting isn't about fists, sweetheart. It's about standing for what matters. And no, I don't get tired of that, because every time I fight for something worth protecting, I remember why I started in the first place." She nodded slowly, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "I think I understand now." He smiled. "Good. Because one day, it won't be me standing for you. It'll be you standing for yourself. And when that day comes, you'll realize you don't need me to protect you anymore. But I'll still be here, watching, proud." The wind stirred the grass in the fields, carrying with it the faint scent of earth and freedom. Danielle closed her eyes, letting the words settle deep inside her. For the first time, she believed them fully. The storm had not destroyed her, it had forged her. And though she still carried the scars of fear, they were now reminders of the strength she had discovered in herself, and of the father who had stood by her side until she could stand on her own. When she finally opened her eyes, the stars were beginning to appear, one by one, lighting the vast Texas sky. She smiled softly, knowing that whatever tomorrow brought, she was ready. And in that quiet, infinite moment beneath the night sky, the daughter of Chuck Norris found her strength. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you never miss the next one. We've got even more unbelievable stories coming your way. Watch the next video right here and dive into the drama. And don't keep this to yourself. Share this video with your friends and family so they can experience it too. The more people join our storytelling family, the wilder the journey gets.